in the sixth meditation, we have still yet to see Descartes make good on the promise expressed by the title of the meditations, which is a demonstration of the existence of God and the real distinction between mind and body. We saw that in both the third meditation and in the fifth meditation. He begins with an eye toward establishing the real existence of a material world, but discovers in the former case that the principle of efficient causality, and in the latter case, the distinction between essence and existence, could both be used for distinct proofs for the existence of God. Okay? Both of which you should be familiar with for the midterm exam, and the latter of those proofs for the fifth quiz. Okay? The so-called ontological proof for God's existence. All right. He begins the sixth meditation by realizing this is it. He's got to show that there is a material world. Because at this point, despite the fact that he's shown so many things, including the existence of himself as a thinking thing, the distinction between substance and accident, between essence and existence, the existence of God as a non-deceiver, and a strategy for avoiding error based on the distinction between intellect and will, he still is captive of his own mind. Because unless there is a material world, all of these are just ideas, except his own reality as a spiritual, finite mental substance, and God as an infinite mental substance. Okay? Now, it does seem odd that God should exist as a non-deceptive entity and create Descartes with such a strong inclination to believe in the existence of a material world. Okay? And indeed, that is going to become the basis for his definitive proof that material things exist. But before he arrives at that place, he makes the observation that his imagination, while possessing an active power, that is, once he has the idea, for example, of a certain color and the idea of a certain shape, he can mix these ideas and imagine new things. Once he's experienced a blue triangle and a red rectangle, he can easily imagine a red triangle and a blue rectangle. Okay? But in order for him to have these ideas in the first place, they must be caused by something. In other words, his imagination must also be passive. It must be receptive as well as active. Okay? And to show that his imagination, the faculty of imagination, is really a different faculty than his faculty of understanding, he asks us to consider the following mind experiment. Try this. Imagine, if you will, and to the best of your ability, a 1,000-sided figure. You can easily imagine a 4-sided figure, a square. You can probably easily imagine a 5-sided figure, okay? Maybe even a 6-sided figure. But I want you to try to imagine a 1,000-sided figure, whatever that brings before your imagination, okay? Which is probably some very nebulous, multi-sided polygon, okay? Now, beside it, I want you to imagine a 1,001-sided figure. Okay? Now, can you imagine the difference? That is, literally bring before your imagination or form the images of a 1,000-sided figure and a 1,001-sided figure and recognize the difference between those two images. You can? Do you see a difference in your mind's eye between the 1,000-sided figure and the 1,001-sided figure? Of course you don't. They are both just vague, very large polygons with a whole bunch of sides. But you certainly understand the difference between those two figures. You understand the difference perfectly. One of them has an extra side. So if you are capable of understanding perfectly the difference between 1,000 sides and 1,001 sides, but you cannot, with equal clarity, imagine the difference between 1,000 sides and 1,001 sides, then the faculty of intellect and the faculty of imagination must be two separate faculties. Because one of them is capable of doing something the other is not. Follow me? Okay. Now, why does he engage us in this thought experiment? Because even though he can understand what is meant by a material world, for example, when he considered the wax, by the wax he understood an extended thing, that is, a thing which takes up space, which is a substance that can host a set of accidents. Okay? And while the accidents can change, the substance of the thing as its reality remains the same. Although he can understand that by a mental substance he means a thinking thing that is not extended, and by a material substance, an extended thing which does not think, okay? It does not follow that the images that he seems to possess of such material things guarantees that such material things exist. Okay? Remember, even though God is a non-deceiver, perhaps he has his reasons for making me believe that there is a material world. Or perhaps I myself possess yet another faculty of mind responsible for producing the images of a physical world. Okay? And even though it seems that my faculty of imagination requires something to activate it, okay? In other words, even though my imagination has an active power, I can create new images. I can imagine things that don't exist. It must first have a passive capability by which it first receives the simple images out of which it creates those complex images. This is not a definitive proof of the existence of a material world, because logically speaking, all that the cause of my idea of a material world must possess is enough reality to give rise to those images. And certainly, God has enough reality to send me the idea of a material world, even if such a world didn't exist. You with me? Okay. So something is giving me the image of a material world. But how do I know that it is a material world itself? If God has the power to send me an image of a material world, how do I know that instead it is actually a material world that is responsible for causing my idea of that world? And the answer to this is really so simple, it's almost laughable. What Descartes says is this: he is so inclined to believe in the existence of a material world. In other words, his experience of what seems to be a world populated by extended things which cause representations of themselves in my imagination. And no matter how long I suspend my judgment, as he learned to do in the fourth meditation, as a tactic for avoiding error, he cannot possibly correct himself for this inclination to believe that there is a material world. If his best effort to suspend judgment until achieving a clear understanding of the material world fails, if it were to turn out that there was no material world, that all of this stuff was just imagery, that the whole material world was an idea and nothing more, then he would have to conclude that God is a deceiver. Because God has created me with such a strong inclination to believe that the material world exists. And no matter how long I suspend judgment about the existence of that world, I cannot correct myself for the belief that that world exists. If it doesn't exist, God would have to be a deceiver. But I've already shown that that is a logical impossibility. Therefore, he concludes the material world exists. Okay? You follow the argument?
It's a morality issue at that point.
Yeah. Well, sure, it comes down to the fact that included in the essence of God is the impossibility of moral imperfection. So if God has created me with such an undeniably strong natural instinct to believe in the existence of material things, if they didn't exist, then he has set me up to believe in something false, which is logically impossible. Okay? So material things exist. But he also promised to show that there was a real distinction between mind, mental substances, and body, material substances. Okay? So again, let us return to what is contained in the idea of each type of substance. By a mental substance, like me, or you, or God, he understands a thinking thing. Okay? That does not have extension. A non-extended thinking thing. And of course, included in this idea of the thinking thing are all the powers of thinking, like imagining, willing, affirming, denying, sensing, etc. Okay? By body or material substance, he understands extended things, that which takes up space but does not think. Okay? But how is he going to demonstrate that these are actually two separate substances? Does anybody know what his proof is? I understand that it's Mardi Gras. Well, it was Mardi Gras. You're tired. But
aside from the divisibility.
That's it. That's the argument. The argument comes down to demonstrating that material substance admits of a possibility that mental substance does not. And that ability is the capacity for being divided.
Like you can physically take a thing and make small pieces of it.
Yes.
But that concept can't apply to an intellect.
That's correct. Body or mental substance as an extended thing can always be divided. I can cut things in half. And theoretically speaking, if I have a sharp enough tool or powerful enough collision, I can go on dividing material things. Okay? But mental substances cannot be divided. Now the first part is simple to understand. Sure, anything that takes up space can be cut in half. But what does he mean by saying that mind cannot be divided? Or why might you argue that it can?
There's a lot of different parts to the way you think, but there's no way for anyone to behave in its own right without it altogether.
Okay, I believe what you're saying is this, and that's correct. Remember, Descartes is given to what I have called faculty talk. he has spoken of the faculty of intellect, or pure intellect. Sometimes he calls that the understanding. He has spoken of the faculty of will, okay? And it is the difference between the faculty of will and the faculty of intellect that led to his account of how we make mistakes.
Why
Right.
it's not God's fault.
Right. Why it's not God's responsibility that my will outstrips the intellect. He's spoken of the faculty of sensation. Okay, there is a part of the mind responsible for receiving sensations. There is the faculty of imagination, which is both passive, it receives images, and active. It can create new images. Okay. So intellect, imagination, sensation, volition, or will. Okay? All faculties of mind. But which of these, according to Descartes, constitutes the essence of the thinking thing? Just the pure intellect. Now, why might he say that? Remember, by the essence of a thing, he means that which makes a thing what it is. It is the indispensable characteristic of a thing. So the essence of body is extension, right? If something takes up no space, then it is not a body. He is saying that the essence of the thinking thing, his foundation, is pure intellect, and that the imagination, sensation, and perhaps even volition are modes of the intellect. So perhaps, and I may be wrong about this, but perhaps you can think about it like this: that just as the color, fragrance, taste, shape, texture are modes of the wax, which is a material substance, imagination, sensation, and volition are modes of the intellect, the mental substance. Okay? And likewise, while the color, shape, texture, fragrance, taste of the wax can change, and yet the wax remains the same material substance that it was, my mind can change its images. I can change my will. I can desire one thing and then I can desire the opposite. Okay? And yet I remain the same being, the same intellect that I always have been. The intellect is the essence of the mental substance. In fact, he goes so far to say that I could exist without the imagination, without the sensation, maybe even exist without my will, and remain essentially the same being that I am now.
Like other organisms that are more simple, I guess.
I suppose, if you could define the essence of a simpler organism, you know, okay? Like, even, you know, if my body is a material substance, okay? Standing and sitting are two possibilities for that substance, or modes of the substance. But whether I'm standing or sitting I am the same, or my body is the same material substance. Okay? So for Descartes, what constitutes the essence of the thinking thing is nothing but the pure intellect. Now, when we move into the empiricist section of the course, I think we're really going to see why this rationalist picture, or at least Descartes' understanding of what is essentially the human mind, is incomplete. Because consider this. Imagine stripping away all content from your mind. Take away everything you've ever sensed. So you've got no idea of color, or shape, or texture, or taste, sound, fragrance. Everything you've ever imagined. What would be left over? Nothing. Okay? Which is why people like John Locke, the empiricist, will say that until we have sensory experience, the mind is completely blank. Okay? But Descartes, as a rationalist, thinks that the mind possesses a priori ideas in the strictest sense, innate ideas. That as soon as there is mind, that mind possesses ideas. An idea of God and an idea of self.
Has anyone in this world of philosophy ever tried to just say maybe both can exist? Or they don't have to be distinct?
What, mind and body?
Like those two theories?
Yeah, Kant. And in a sense, everything we've done so far is in anticipation of the work of Immanuel Kant. Okay? Of course, at the same time, after we consider Kant, I think I could make an argument that everything in Kant was already said in Plato, like everything else in the history of philosophy. Okay. Back to this business about the indivisibility of mind. Certainly, I can change my mind, right? I can think at one moment about a tree, and then at the next moment I can think about a rock. But that is not dividing the mind. That is the same mind entertaining different ideas. Okay? And even if we were to admit the possibility of multiple personality disorder, which, as far as I understand, contemporary psychiatry dismisses, okay, as a, pseudo affliction. But let's just imagine that multiple personality disorder could be real. You can only be one personality at a time. Okay?
All come from the same mind.
Right. Here's, I think, what he has in mind. Imagine that we were meditating in the more transcendental sense, where we clear the mind of content. Just focus on the breath. Enter into the void. Okay? Enter into the nothingness. And achieve just pure awareness. One cannot divide that awareness from itself. To say that the mind is divisible would mean that I can be two different minds at the same time. But I can't. I can only think from one perspective. The mind, or what I might just call thinking, cannot be divided from itself. Okay? So if he is right, that body can always be divided, but mind is wholly indivisible. That means that body possesses a property which mind does not, namely divisibility, from which it follows that mind and body are really two different kinds of substance. And so, of course, material substances exist whether or not there is a mind to apprehend them. Okay? When we leave the room, the desks remain here. Okay? They don't vanish simply because we're not here to think about them. But more interestingly, mind can exist without body. Which means a few things. The most obvious thing is that mind is not equal to brain. Okay? We know that the mind and the brain are intimately related in some way because, a neurologist can stimulate parts of your brain and evoke certain images. Okay? And that when the brain is damaged in certain areas, it affects our mental abilities. Okay? Well, drawing a hard distinction, a real distinction, as opposed to merely a verbal distinction between mind and body, leads to a host of problems, which collectively get called the mind-body problem. Okay? And the mind-body problem manifests itself in a number of ways. Perhaps the most troublesome way has to do with their interaction. Okay? If mind is a thinking thing that doesn't take up any space, and body is an extended thing which doesn't do any thinking, how does mind cause changes in the material world? And how can the material world cause changes in my mind? How do they interact? Because as far as we understand, at least at the macro level, the only thing that can cause a change to a physical body is a force, a physical force. Because a body at rest will remain at rest until acted upon by some force, right? And what is force? It's mass times acceleration. But if mind takes up no space, then it has no mass. So how does something which has no mass, takes up no space, make a change in the physical world so that when I make the decision to lift the folder, my body does it? How can a thought create alterations to a world governed strictly by Newton's laws of mechanics. Let me give you another demonstration of the problem here. If I throw a rock into a pond and it causes a ripple effect, okay? Then the outermost ripple, of course, is the effect of the ripple just before it, which is its cause, which is itself caused by the ripple before it, and so on, back to the rock, which strikes the water, and the movement of the rock was caused by my hand and arm, and I can explain the movement of my arm in terms of the muscles and electrochemical signals transferred by neurons from the brain, okay? But if you believe that you made the free decision to throw the rock, then your freedom cannot be something physical, because all physical events are determined by other physical events. It would seem that if freedom is possible, if you are genuinely free, then your mind cannot be a physical thing. It may require the brain to interact with the body so long as the mind is captive of the body. But imagine this, and I owe this illustration to someone, and I can't remember whose illustration it is, so I'll have to make good on that reference. But imagine a person in a locked room, okay? And the only way that the person can see the outer world is through a window, okay? Now, so long as the person is in the room, he or she requires the window in order to see what is outside, okay? Likewise, if the person is like the mind, so long as the mind is locked inside the body, it requires the brain, like the window, to interact with the outside world. But once the person is let out of the room, the window is no longer necessary. Likewise, if the mind were freed from the body, it would no longer require the brain. All right. So here are some important things I really want you to keep in mind. That this real distinction between mind and body, first of all, creates a number of difficulties. The first one I talk about is the difficulty of explaining interaction. How do non-physical thoughts give rise to physical events? Okay? Because that violates Newton's laws of mechanics. Here's another problem, or another facet of the mind-body problem. Mind is my thinking. It is inner, okay? It is my inner experience, because you can't see what I'm thinking. Body is outer. Okay? Even my own body is outside of, in a sense, my mind. And when it comes to how the mind comes to know body, we refer to them as subject and object. Mind is subject, body is object. So I say something like, I see the table. The I refers to the mind or the subject that sees or knows the object, in this case, the table. Okay? But if mind is inner and a non-physical substance, and body is outer, then I am forever cut off from a direct unity or identity of thinking with material being. After all, we all see the clock, and we say that the clock is an object. It is out there. Okay? But my mind, subject, is never one with the clock, which is object. Somehow, the object gives a representation of itself. It sends a picture of itself to your mind. So the question is, how can I ever establish that my understanding of the thing is an accurate interpretation of the thing? Well, what would Descartes' answer be? Even though mind and body are really separate, and therefore I can never have a perfect identity of mind and body, they never become the same thing. Because I know that God exists and is a non-deceiver and has given me two faculties, intellect and will, which if used in the right way can avoid error, then it is at least possible for me to suspend judgment about the objective world until I have a relatively clear picture of it. So what we call Descartes' theory of knowledge, his epistemology, is indirect realism. The material world is a real thing, just as the mind is a real thing. Okay? But my access to that real material world is indirect. It is mediated by my senses. Okay? The only way for me to have a perfect understanding of an object would be to become one with that object. But since mind and body are really two distinct things, I never become one with the object. So now, do you see why the existence of God is among the first things that must be established if I am to have knowledge of the world in the sciences? Because unless I know that God exists and has created me as a non-deceptive entity, that is, God as a non-deceptive entity has created me in such a way that I can achieve a relatively accurate representation of the world, then I would have no way of knowing that my idea of the world accurately portrays that world.
Do you agree with that personally?
No. No, I don't. But then again, I personally think that asking whether I can have a perfect understanding of that which is outside of me is the wrong question. In fact, I think that the distinction is flawed. I personally think that ultimately, whatever I am made of is exactly the same thing the rest of the world is made of. It's just organized differently. And that when I experience what I call a world, I'm experiencing myself as much as anything else. I literally am looking at my own mind. But we'll start to understand what I mean by that when we look at Kant. Okay? So I want you to understand the legacy that Descartes gives us. The mind-body dualism and all of its problems. And I want you to remember I can express this in a number of ways. Mind, body, inner, outer, subject, object. Okay? These all express this basic dualistic picture of the world. What is constituted by two really different kinds of thing. There are minds and there are bodies. The question is, how do they interact? Okay. And if I cannot explain how they interact, this ought to at least raise my suspicion that there's something wrong with the distinction. Okay. So we have this picture of ourselves as minds, which, by the way, are not to be equated with brain. Somehow, mind uses the brain to interact with the physical world. And when Descartes was asked, how do they interact, or where do they interact, he gave an answer which is completely unsatisfactory, and he must have known it. Descartes said that the mind and body interact in the part of the brain where the common sense resides. And he called that the pineal gland.
Third eye.
Can you repeat that statement?
Yes.
Descartes said that the mind and body.
Descartes explains the interaction of mind and body in terms of a part of the brain called the pineal gland. Now, why does this not solve the mind-body problem? Because the pineal gland is body. It just pushes the problem back. Because now I have to explain how the pineal gland, which is body, interacts with that which is not body, mind. So this metaphysical picture of the world, which is dualistic, and I want you to keep in mind that this is a real metaphysical dualism. It is much more rigid than that which we find in Plato, for example. Remember, we say Plato is a dualist because he speaks of the intelligible and the visible, right? But these two realms are not really distinct, because the visible realm could not exist without the intelligible realm. It's a reflection of it. But for Descartes, mind and body are really distinct, because minds can exist without bodies, and bodies can exist without minds. Okay? Now this metaphysical dualism, and you understand why I'm calling it metaphysical, because we're talking about two different types of reality. Two different real things. Gives rise to an epistemological dualism between subject and object. How does subject come to know the object? Okay? And this model of knowledge is what we call representationalism. What is outer? Okay? The board somehow sends a representation of itself to my sensory apparatus, which then gets interpreted by the mind. Okay? So within my mind is formed a picture of the world. Okay? And under this thinking, the world is thought to be a thing that exists in itself. After all, I'm looking at the television set, but when I turn away from it, I believe that it is still there. Okay? While I'm looking at it, its physical characteristics are carried by light waves or something to my eyes, which then stimulate, neurons in the brain and give rise to some sort of picture. That's what we call representationalism. The world is represented to my mind. And the way it is represented to my mind is certainly different than the way it is represented to your mind. Okay? One of us might be colorblind, or jaundiced, or suffer from some other kind of sensory affliction. Okay?
Or depth of perception.
Right. Even our moods alter the way the world shows up. Okay? If you're in a good mood, the world is glorious. If you're in a crappy mood, the world is miserable. Okay? But based on this representational model of knowledge, whereby the world is an object that is separate from mind, which is subject, arises a particular conception of truth, or a theory of truth called correspondence. The correspondence theory of truth is the prevailing notion of what it means to be true in the modern period. Okay? The Latin is this: veritas, truth, is an adequatio, or correspondence between the intellect, intellectus, and thing, right? We've already seen that Descartes' dualism is between the res cogitans, the thing that thinks, and the res extensa, the thing which is extended, mind and body. Res cogitans, res extensa. Okay? So truth is a correspondence between intellect and thing. In other words, when what I'm thinking corresponds to the way the thing about which I am thinking actually is, then my thinking is true. So when I say the light is on, what makes my proposition true? Well, certainly.
It's right.
Hmm?
It's right.
These are what tells me that the light is on. But what makes the statement true is that the light is on. Okay? If I say that the bag is blue, what makes my statement true, okay, and the statement or the proposition is just the expression of what I'm thinking, okay? What makes my statement true is when it accurately corresponds to the way the thing is. Truth is a correspondence, a matching up of thinking and being. But of course, again, the problem is that the only way for me to have a perfect correspondence of thinking and being would be a collapse of the distinction between mind and body. I would have to become one with the object in order to know it perfectly. Okay? So if you want to hold on to this dualistic picture of the world, you need what has been called the third man. Okay? There's me, there's the thing I seek to know, but then I need another mind that can see what I'm thinking and see the truth about the object and say, yes, you've got it right. And the only mind qualified to give a perfect answer to that would be God. Okay? So that's why the existence of God and the real distinction between mind and body were primary foundational ideas that ground the possibility of any system of knowledge. Whether it is knowledge of the celestial bodies or knowledge of the human body, okay? whatever it is I seek to know, first, I have to establish that the thing I seek to know is real, okay? And I need to establish the existence of a non-deceptive, omniscient mind who has an interest in my getting it right. That's an awful lot of work to be able to say that the sky is blue. Okay? But what an ambitious project to seek absolute certainty. Okay? But hopefully now you understand why Descartes says that before I can achieve certainty in any science, I must establish a stable foundation from which to proceed. The most basic foundational claim is his awareness of mind, his own mind, because that, of course, is what he is immediately aware of. But belonging to that awareness, for Descartes at least, is an idea of God. And because from that idea of God, he finds himself justified in concluding the existence of God as his own non-deceptive creator who has endowed him with the capability of making correct judgments about the world which exists external to himself, then so long as I am using my faculties responsibly, that is, in the way they were intended to be used, not making a judgment until I have a clear and distinct conception, I now have a basis for proceeding to build up specific realms of knowledge. But they all, no matter what kind of knowledge I seek, ultimately are grounded in this distinction between the knower and the known, the mind and the body, the inner and the outer, the subject and the object, and the existence of God, which is essentially the guarantor that when I use my faculties correctly, I can achieve an indirect knowledge of the object.